Welcome to Empowered Living. I'm Ann Shu. On this podcast, innovative leaders and visionary experts share insights and practical tools for work, family, and marriage. Each episode, we'll explore how to elevate your life while staying grounded in what truly matters to you. You're working hard to navigate relationships, build a thriving family, and create a legacy of purpose. We're here to help you do that with confidence and intentionality. So if you're ready to live a life by design, you're in the right place. Today, we are talking about how we show up for our kids, not just as parents, but as partners in growth, communication, and emotional safety. My guest today is Lainie Liberti, author, speaker, and founder of Project World School. Lainie brings a grounded, eye-opening perspective to parenting in today's complex world. We talk about moving away from old models of authority and into something more collaborative, where listening, mental health, and presence matter more than perfection. She also shares her experience with world schooling and how travel and flexibility can deepen learning, connection, and trust within the family. Let's dive in. Hi, Lainie. How are you doing today?
Really good. Thank you for asking.
I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while.
Well, let's dive in because
Okay.
I know you've got so much wisdom to share, and I want to make sure that we give you plenty of time to do that. So let's start with parenting. And I know that, it's so interesting because parenting and parenting philosophy can be such a sticky thing to talk about because people get really defensive about their parenting styles and the way that they've parented. And so talk to me about your experience with parenting and really the shift from authoritarian parenting to a more collaborative parenting style.
Yeah. First of all, I do have to premise this with I never was an authoritarian parent. However, I'm somebody who I'm an autodidactic, always have been my entire life, and learning and researching and reading and listening and asking questions. All of that has made up pretty much, the essence of who I am. And so when there's something I'm interested in, I will research and I'll go deep. And so I could tell you I've read probably 100 books on different parenting styles. I've read books on peaceful parenting and gentle parenting and conscious parenting and, oh my gosh, you name it, attachment parenting. And I've gone down some really deep dives into these specific areas. And I think each one has absolute merits. And for me, as somebody who was raised in a household where I had a lot of trauma growing up, and I'm sure many people in our generation can join the chorus of that statement, because parenting wasn't so much talked about. It was, you do as I say, and I yell at you until you do what I say. And there were a lot of unhealed parents parenting, and therefore those things were passed on to us generationally. I think the great thing is a lot of us in our generation now have woken up and taken accountability and responsibility to heal those traumas and those wounds, and have been motivated not to parent the way that we were parented. At least that's the space that I was coming from. And as somebody who was raised in a highly authoritative environment, and I was yelled at every day of my life. My nervous system was completely dysregulated. I would shake when I heard somebody yelling, even if it wasn't directed at me, and even if it wasn't a parent. I had that physical response, knowing in my heart of hearts I did not want to parent in that same way. So part of the reason why I was never an authoritarian parent was because I didn't want to parent like my parents. So I knew what I didn't want, but I wasn't sure what I did want, which again caused me to do all of this research. And I can tell you, as I said, there are merits in all of these different philosophies. But the one thing that I was very, very sensitive to was authoritarianism in parenting. Because anytime you took away the sovereignty of this other human being that was entrusted to you to guide, raise, facilitate, support, protect, it felt completely contrary to the alignment or misalignment that I had when I was parented and the way that I knew that I wanted to parent. And so with some of the peaceful parenting or gentle parenting or hand-in-hand parenting, sometimes there are things that I find that are beneath the surface manipulative. And
Mhm.
even though you say, yes, sweetie, and then you give them an alternative to do something that you really want them to do, which is really against their will, that to me is also authoritarianism masked underneath a cupcake filling, It
Mm.
just, so that sensitivity to that kind of manipulation became a part of my guidance. And so what I found was partnership or collaborative, as you call it, collaborative parenting, partnership parenting became the sort of the signal that I followed. I know that if I treat my partners with respect, my partners in romantic or business relationships, they will make mistakes, but they will also tap into who they are and what they want to do. I by no means feel like I'm capable of saying to a romantic partner, you must pick up your socks and clean your room right now because I want you to. Like, those are not the relationship that I want to have with somebody, or in turn, I don't want them to say those things to me. And so I'm accountable to know when I'm triggered or when something is not in alignment or something doesn't sit right with me. If I'm bothered by socks or messiness, I need to look at why that is. Does it feel to me like I'm losing control? Does it feel to me like I'm in danger? Does it feel to me like I'm not safe? Maybe those are some unhealed wounds that I need to look at, but I'm accountable for that. But I'm also accountable for saying to my partner, these things are coming up in me, and I'm responsible for looking at why these things are triggering to me. But just so you know, in this partnership, when one person's triggered, it's important to communicate that. Communication is one of the foundations, communication and accountability, one of the foundations of partnership. And so I took that to my parenting. I took those philosophies into my parenting, and I've of course made it age appropriate. And of course, when my son, when he was young, didn't want to brush his teeth, for example, I would invite him to come and join me and be my partner in this journey of me brushing my teeth. And I'd make it joyful for him. I'd sit him on the counter. I would pull out the toothbrush and I'd talk about, look at these little bristles. Do you think that they're pointing this way because they're not happy? Age appropriate stuff, that sort of thing. And I'd make it a game. I'd put the toothpaste on and I'd brush, brush, brush. And I'd make it something that I was doing for my own health because I was taking responsibility. And I never forced him to brush his own teeth. But 1 or 2 days of not brushing his teeth and sitting and making it a fun activity to be with me while I'm doing that, he chose to brush his teeth, and that became his choice. And it wasn't manipulative. It was playful. It was modeling what was important to me and letting him know the benefits and why I made those choices. I let him know what my preferences are, but I truly did not manipulate him. I created an experience that worked for both of us so that he could make, quote unquote, informed choices about his own body.
That's beautiful. What do you say to the parents who are listening and they're like, that sounds amazing, but that takes so much time that I don't have?
Mm, guess what? It does. It does. And partially why I chose to unschool and eventually world school my son, and why I chose to parent in this way, was because it was important for me in my childhood to have an adult show up for me that didn't. And that became one of my motivators, one of my motivations in making the choices that I made for the parenting that I did. I wrote a book, and we could talk about that later. but the title is Seen, Heard, and Understood. And as a teen, and we can talk about the teen years, which is kind of my area of expertise, that was the thing that I desired more than anything in the world. I needed to have an adult show up for me, and I needed to feel like I was seen, heard, and understood. And from an early age, parenting a young child, I knew that I never wanted my teen to go in, my young child to go into his adolescence having those needs. I always wanted him to know that I showed up for him. And so even when I was running a business and working upwards 80 hours a week, I knew that the time that I did have was super special and super important. And I filled that time with very attentive presence. I filled that time with playfulness and games and joy. And I filled that time very intentionally for him. But what it did was it caused me to want more of that time. And eventually I changed my lifestyle almost completely so I could show up for him when he was around 9 or 10. So the commitment made me really, wholeheartedly want to change my life so that I could show up for this human being for the limited time that I had him. Our childhoods go by so fast. It blows me away, but I have zero regrets.
Now I want to talk about the unschooling and the world schooling later. So let's come back to that. But I want to dive a little bit deeper on something that you mentioned earlier about this collaborative approach that you have with parenting. And it made me think about my parenting and how I want to do things a certain way with my parenting style, but I often find myself slipping back into the authoritarian parenting style when I'm tired or if my energy is low or I'm being impatient. I find myself slipping back to what I know, which is really how I was raised. And so what tips, tricks, suggestions do you have for people like me that want to do things differently, but it's hard to really be consistent because we're fighting against our own upbringing? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I don't use tips or tricks. I use tools.
Yeah.
And the reason why I use tools, and especially, scientifically proven,
Yeah.
and tested tools, is because they don't judge. They are something that is outside of ourselves, that is completely objective. And if you have the goal of making a change, you've got to make a change on many levels within yourself, right? And it takes practice and it takes patience and it takes perseverance. So you've got to do this over and over. The other thing is you've got to be willing to forgive yourself when you slip back into your programming. Changing your programming takes time. There are many levels of learning and doing and being. And when I are speaking from a conscious level, and this is the 5% of our computing, of our brain computing, the other 95% doesn't want to be disturbed, but it dictates what comes out of this 5% of us interacting in the conscious thinking brain. The other 95% usually will kick us out when we try to reprogram it because it doesn't want to be changed, as I said. And the goal of this 95% is self-preservation. And so if you learned what you learned when you were a child, those things worked for you because you're sitting right here. You're preserved. You're here. You survived. And so the subconscious thinking brain will say, wait a minute, don't tell me what to do. You can speak those words, but I am going to run these programs because I know it's true, tried and tested that they work. If those programs are not in alignment, you've got to do some subconscious work. And there's a lot of tools in my book to do that. This should not be gate kept by psychologists or psychiatrists. These should be tools that we can choose to use and commit to and, do the work to make the change. Now, change is not fast. So when you are in the process, and it's lifelong work, when you're in the process of reprogramming, especially those of us who grew up with trauma, because those are deeply anchored with emotions. We get triggered and we know that these things happen. You need to make it a family affair. You need to say to your children, it doesn't matter how old they are. You need to say, Mommy, if it's a young child, Mommy's trying to be a better mom. And, I grew up with some things that became habit. And I am sorry I made a mistake. I'm sorry. And I'm trying to do better. And I invite you to let me know when I'm making a mistake. That was one of the gifts that I actually did give my son. And I remember very specifically, he was 12 years old. I was frustrated. We were living in Cusco, Peru. I got triggered by something that he said I think it was something he did in the kitchen. I can't remember the thing, but I do remember snapping at him and telling him not to do that and to back off or to do something. He was quite shocked that these were the auto words that came out of my mouth. And he said, Mom, pause. You are acting like grandma. And that was a gift that I gave him because I told him about the stuff that I grew up with. And I never, ever, ever wanted to be like that. And that made me pause. That made me retreat. That made me excuse myself from the situation and cry a little bit and then come back and apologize. And that kind of repairing, Dr. Daniel Siegel talks a lot about repairing, but that kind of repairing really helped us to deeply connect. And I'll tell you, he's never used that sort of secret weapon that I gave him ever again because I haven't gone to that space. But one of the very simple tools, not tip or trick, but tools that I use and help other families to use when they're in their parenting journey is first to cultivate a habit of pausing. And it to an outside eye, looking in, a bird's eye view in a family, if the family really starts adapting this process of pausing, it may look like the family's in slow motion and there are gaps and, you need to like speed up the video or something. But pausing is a powerful tool. It stops the autopilot or the reaction stage. You want to be in a stage where you've practiced pausing enough, you understand what your auto response will be, and then instead of auto responding, right, you can respond in a way that's intentional to this 5% thinking brain that you're interacting with me right now, right?
I love that example. It reminds me, I've been, every night when I put my 2-year-old to bed, one of the things that we'll do first that we'll practice together is deep breaths. As soon as he lays down, we'll do some deep breaths together. And I don't remember when it started, but I mean, he's 2 and he can tell when I am getting tense or stressed or angry, or if he hears me like yelling, he will say, Mama, and then he'll just look at me and he'll go, it's such a big reality check from my 2-year-old, reminding me that I need to pause and just take a breath. But
Here's the
oh,
Here's the thing, 2-year-olds, we in Western society believe 2-year-olds are incapable,
yeah.
but they're not. They
Right.
are full human beings that are gaining skills, but they are born little souls. They are born full people.
Yeah.
And so the empowerment of knowing that can shift the way that you parent. There's a great book that I read early on in my parenting journey that I recommend to everybody. It's called The Continuum Concept. And that helped me recognize that these are, yes, they're smaller human beings, but they're full human beings. Whereas in Western culture, we believe that these are empty vessels that we need to open up their head and put the information in. When you start believing that they're already born with everything, maybe not the skills, but the knowing. They know who they are.
Yeah.
They know what sovereignty feels like. They know when it's being stepped on and their spirit's broken. They know that, not because They learned it because they're born whole. And if we can shift the way that we connect with this human being that is entrusted to you for this short period of time of their lives, it shifts the way that we interact to more collaboration. Yes, we want to keep them safe, but they're capable of reflecting when mama's feeling
Mhm.
stressed. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. So you mentioned earlier that one of your zone of genius is mental health for teens. So let's shift and talk about that. Tell me, what do you see are some common parenting patterns that maybe are unintentionally shutting down teens or detrimental to their teens?
Well, I mean, there's the basic stuff, the overscheduling, the really not listening, the becoming triggered or offended when they start to individuate, the lack of trust. Like there's all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of things that are very specific to now. And I'm normally I say I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but in reality, it just is how I see things. So if you're offended, I apologize in advance. However, I think I'm first going to say, I've studied psychology, and psychology to me is the framework that makes sense to me. I think it's quite well developed and it's proven. And I truly believe that a lot of psychology can help us understand self or each other, right? And I think that's really important. And I use psychology in my practice, and I believe that it's a powerful, again, framework. However, because it's been expanded so much, people are self diagnosing
Mm,
themselves now with specific, he must have ADHD.
mm,
Or beyond the self diagnosis, people identify as their diagnosis
mm,
and stop taking accountability for themselves. If we are diagnosed, or even if we believe and we're self diagnosed, we have a specific thing. That's not where life stops. That's where life starts. It starts at that point because we can now understand the framework of our own mental processing to use tools to help us. I respond better to tools that are like this because I have this. That's all. But what I see is a lot of, what is the word I'm looking for? It's on the tip of my tongue. It's a very common word. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't think of this word, but it's when, here's the word, enabling. You
mm,
have this, so you don't have to be accountable for your own actions, words, whatever, and that to me is creating it's creating a lot of chaos in this culture, and
mm,
I do believe there's manipulation around that. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is there's a lot of issues in the world today, real issues around safety. Every human being, especially developing human beings, right? When we're ages 0 to 7 and then up to the end of our adolescence, our brains, which is usually around 25, just to be clear, our brains are still developing, right? But we have neuroplasticity throughout our lives. So we can, of course, develop and learn beyond 25. But these are critical times, right? And knowing that the world is changing in many ways, most of us lived through COVID just recently, right? Except for, of course, the 3 or 4 year old who did not. But they are a product of those times. And we think differently about one another now. Some people are, in the midst of political, division, and that division can make us feel unsafe as well. Some people are experiencing, our family and friends are experiencing war just, this week. We are in very turbulent times, and safety is something that needs to be addressed and discussed in the family. I don't think shielding, our children or our family from the world is, is the only option. I think there's got to be a balance. We create safety in the home. We create safety in the bond of our family, but we also together as a family create plans for outer world safety should we need that. And we're aware. We are, living in a time where it's important to have these communications. Yeah. So those are two things that are very controversial, especially in my field right now.
Yeah.
But I think they're important to address and to talk about.
How do you support a teenager without projecting our own fears onto them or even our own hopes and dreams? Like, how do we really support them for who they are and really separate like our own emotion
Right.
from that?
So again, it's learning the skills of communication. One part of communication is active listening, and I'll tell you most parents, most people don't know how to do that. They just don't. There are tools. I think there's one in hand parenting. Can't remember what it's called. I read about it years ago and I thought it was an amazing tool where you do just a 20-minute listening and you
Mm,
interrupt. And I can't remember what it's called. And if anybody who's listening to your podcast, let you know because it's one of those really powerful tools. But listening is super important. When you are in partnership, right? You may let's say, with your business partner, you are in business and you are sharing responsibilities with another human being. And let's say it's something like an ad agency, right? You have one person who does writing and they are amazing with words. You have another person who does visual and art, things of that nature. And yes, you have different skills, but together you have the same goal, right?
mm,
It's to serve the goal of that particular client, whatever your project is. And you can bring these examples to any kind of partnership. So in my parenting, I have certain skills and I have certain preferences and I have certain abilities, but you have certain skills and certain preferences and certain abilities. But together, when we come together, if the goal is to create joyful and happy and well rounded lives, we need to have conversations around that because your perspective and skills are going to dictate a different perspective than I am. And especially when we are parenting and the teens are starting to individuate, we need to go on a listening journey. We need to make sure that we understand their perspectives and interests and
mm,
fears and concerns. We are allowed 100% to share what our perspectives are. And I see in you, my teen child, the skills, that are really strong in this area. And maybe it's worth considering pursuing that, but you don't have to. Just put that into your pocket or into your resources and know that you have that should you want to pursue it at some point. Talk to me, teen child, about what lights you up. I love that expression. What lights you up
mm,
right now? And you're allowed to change that in any moment when it
mm.
no longer lights you up. Because guess what? As adults, we should be able to quit our job if we're not happy there, right? We should be able to make a shift or a change in our life. And we do as adults, but we want to give those skills to our children in a safe space where they can try it out and see how those things feel. If we're seeing our child go down a self-destructive path, yes, by all means, it's our job to run interference, to create a supportive network so they have help to recognize red flags, to look at risky behaviors and drugs and things of that nature, and create safe spaces to talk about it. So lots and lots to unpack. I write about a lot of this stuff in my book. Yeah.
Okay, let's shift a little bit because I really want to dive into the unschooling and the world schooling. I know you did that with your son for 10, 15 years.
I mean, the question is, did we ever stop? He's now 26 and we both live in Mexico. And for this chapter of our lives, I mean, he lives with his girlfriend. We live in the same city, but we co-own a board game cafe now, which
Oh.
came from our parenting. And part of the thing that was important in our family culture was playfulness and board games and really spending quality time together. So now that he's 26, he does all of these other things, but he still chose to be in partnership with me now in a business perspective. So yeah. Are we still unschooling, partnering, world schooling? I mean, yes, we're in a foreign country. We're speaking, I mean, all of these things. It's not, yeah. So we started when he was 9. And like I said, he's now 26. But every day we participate in cultural immersion. Every day we practice being present, and we're still learning so much. So as lifelong learners, we're still involved. But yeah, what can I tell you about unschooling or world schooling?
Did you, when he turned 9, when you guys started doing this, was it a flip of the switch or did you slowly make your way into this lifestyle? Like, were you guys already doing some sort of homeschooling or was he in a full-time public school and then you said, you know what, we're gonna take take a break from this and do our own thing for a while?
Yeah, that's what happened. He was 9. He was finishing up 4th grade, and I was the owner of a branding agency in Los Angeles. And it was 2008, and the economy crashed. And I was overstressed and overworked. And I just looked at him one night and I said to him, what do you think if we just got rid of all this stuff and go take and have an adventure together? And he said, you serious? Yeah. And that was it. So I was going to shut my business. Even, it was going to shut itself because clients were going away left and right. I had worked in advertising and branding and design for almost 20 years. And this was very, very serious for my business. But because I was overworked and overstressed, and he said these words to me, Mom, you're always working. You never spend any time with me. Even though I did spend time with him, it just wasn't enough. I wanted to make that change. So we decided to pack up, sell everything, or give it away and go have a year adventure. We put some stuff in storage. So we took a year and we had a plan that we created together, and we decided to do it in partnership. And we were going to be in partnership with everything, the money, the decisions of where we're going, the adventure, how long we'd stay, how long everything. And it was so much fun. And yeah, so that one year turned into, well, it hasn't ended. Let's just say that. We've had lots of different transformations. We've been around the world. We've been to more than 40 countries. We opened up a business together, taking teens to different places in the world. And in fact, I'm leaving in about less than a month to take another group of teens to Peru to have this immersive learning experience and, real deep inner world exploration while we're exploring the outer worlds. So we're still doing this through our company called Project World School. And, so much changed and we've transformed over the time. And I've gotten old. He's gotten older. He's grown up. But yeah, all of it came from that decision, that decision that night, that question, when I was inspired and the words spoke through me. I didn't even know I was speaking those words. What do you think if we get rid of all this stuff and go have an adventure? And that's what happened.
Did you consider other homeschooling methodologies before you landed on a unschooling, world schooling approach?
World schooling didn't exist. We brought the word into the lexicon of the public, and that took us quite a while to do, by the way. So it didn't exist before we started, organizing around it. But that's a whole story in of itself. We My son was in school. He was in traditional school, public school, when we left. It wasn't working for him. He was really bored.
Mm.
His teachers, when he finished his assignments, would ask him to go help the other kids with whatever they're working on. And he resented that. He didn't like that. He's like, it's not my job.
Yeah.
Even as a 8, 9-year-old, he did not like that. And the other kids made fun of him for being this smart kid. And so taking him out of school, again, we were only planning on traveling for 1 year. I knew in my heart of hearts that this 1 year of travel, he would learn more than he would learn in 5th grade. So we chose not to do any school. And I knew that when we came back to the States a year later, he'd go into 6th grade, he'd still be ahead of them. I had no fears there. But as soon as we decided about 8 months into our journey to continue this thing, that we were doing, and we weren't going to go back, I started researching again, the deep dive, all that stuff into educational models that were alternative. And I discovered that there was this thing called unschooling. And unbeknownst to us, because I had never heard of it before, because I had never gone down this path of research, I also discovered that we were already doing it. And I discovered that it was such a natural way to interact. And we were very intentional about everything that we were doing. When we were traveling for that first year, we started a podcast together, and we both would land in a place. We would say, okay, now here we are in Guatemala, in Antigua. Let's see who we can meet. Let's research the history of it. Let's write our story together. Let's interview somebody. Let's, do whatever. And we together would write, produce, and record our podcast, which was educational, sharing the things that we were experiencing and learning. And that intentionality was totally rooted from the place of curiosity, which we both really, really were. So we were having this side-by-side partnership learning experience, but we didn't know what it was called. We didn't even bother to identify it. Once we learned we were doing it, I started writing about this, and I started blogging and organizing people around, look, you can do this thing called unschooling and travel. And here's how you can do it. And I started calling it world schooling. And that's how people started coming together. Launched, I had a blog that surprisingly gained thousands and thousands and thousands, sometimes some months, tens of thousands of readers, which was crazy. It was I just wrote it so we would have this thing to remember our travel. And people started listening to podcasts. Let me tell you, this was 16 years ago. This was before podcasting and blogging were really popular. I mean, WordPress was in its first version. It was crazy. I don't even think WordPress 16 years ago was even a thing. Because I had the skills. I knew how to use WYSIWYGs and make blogs and stuff like that. It was crazy how much attention this got. So I opened up a Facebook group and went to all the travel groups, family travel groups, and invited them to come, and eventually grew this movement into 50, 60,000 families. Crazy. And then I started running conferences around world schooling. I ran 10 of them all around the world for thousands of families. So I was really active in bringing this terminology, this lexicon to the public awareness, and people started using the term world schooling, and I'm so thrilled. I mean, I can't say I'm the first person who world schooled or used that term, but I'm the person who actively brought this. I had never heard it before. We brought this to the public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what's your advice for the families that want to incorporate some of the best practices or the values from world schooling, unschooling, but they aren't able to quite take that leap and do it quite yet? So, like their kids are still in traditional settings. What is your advice to those families in the interim? What are some things that they can be doing now, even with their child in a traditional school setting, that would incorporate some of the lessons learned, best practices from world schooling and unschooling?
Sure. World schooling to me is really about immersion. And I think the world is a beautiful place. Yeah, it's not super stable at the moment in some places, but the world is filled with people. And people include moms, dads, families, children, and cultures that are rich traditions. And to me, all of those things are worth immersing ourselves into. I love world schooling because the more that I learn about the world, the more I can learn about my own world view, which helps me see the lenses. I can identify those lenses, and that will help me see some of the blind spots. It'll also help me to be more globally minded. Connection and humanity are super important to me. I've spoken with people from all walks of lives, all different economic backgrounds, even, this is a family show, but scary. If you think this is scary, I did not. I even had a wonderful conversation, connective conversation where I was in tears with a gangbanger in Nicaragua that was recently sent back, deported back to Nicaragua because he grew up in the United States, murdered somebody, went to jail because he was in a gang with his people, was sent back to Nicaragua, had tattoos all over his face, but wanted nothing more to talk to my son and I because he never learned Spanish. He was taken out of his community so young that all he knew was the gang where he lived in Florida and English. And when we were in Nicaragua, he didn't want to harm us. He wanted to connect. He wanted to speak. He wanted to be heard. And he wanted to be seen. And as a human being to another human being, we sat for hours and just listened and talked and had this really deep connection for these couple hours and parted ways. Wanted nothing more than that experience. And that taught me so much about humanity. And it taught me about the lenses that I see other people through and allowed me to understand when I had biases that came up to remind me of this beautiful soul that I had connected with years before that wanted nothing more but that human to human connection in that moment. So the world is an important, learning through the world is an important lesson. And if you cannot travel, you can watch films in different, from different countries. You can, as a family, cook food from a different culture. You could, do potlucks or learn a language together. All of these things help you to immerse yourself to start seeing the world through different perspectives. And also the awareness of where are my blind spots? What are the lenses I'm only seeing the world through? I wear glasses, so they always put these lenses in the machine. And so that's the hand movement that I'm doing. What are the lenses that are clouding the way that I see the world, right? And allowing ourselves to know more about ourselves.
Before we wrap up, can you tell our listeners about your book?
Sure. I wrote a book right in the middle of the pandemic. I was working with teens, as I said, for many, many years, taking teens to different places in the world, and had always used these to reflect and create these circles of communication where we're outside of our comfort zone because we're in a new country and we're having this great experience. And then the tools that we would use would be to process the inner world stuff and also to talk about the worldviews and where those biases come from and where those fears and beliefs come from and how to recognize them when they get in the way of us being present. So I started using those tools in an online form when the world was locked down for all those years and serving teens that way. But I could only serve so many teens in my courses, teaching them these tools and creating online communities and creating safe spaces online. And so I decided to put all of the things that I was learning and teaching, learning from the teens themselves about what they needed at home, because those were a lot of the conversations that I would hear. I put those things into a book, and I recognized that the partnership parenting, or as you call it, collaborative parenting, which is the same thing really,
Mhm.
a lot of people don't know how to actually even access that or what it means. And so I put that into my book as well. And my book is called Seen, Heard, and Understood, as I said before. But the subtitle is Parenting and Partnering with Teens for Greater Mental Health. And the focus is on mental health, but not just the teens' mental health. It's on the family's mental health. And so I walk parents through understanding what is happening in the internal worlds of both the child, the adolescent, and their own programming, as we talked about a little earlier, and using tools that are non-judgmental, that are objective, that are outside of themselves, that can be a thing that you can use in order to help know yourself better from the inside, know your motivations, know the triggers, know the what's in alignment, what's not in alignment. Define those core values. Let's talk about them. All of these things are tools. And so I put that into my book, even though I'm teaching the teens this in my courses, to have a family who's going along and doing the work as well. Now they have this language that they can come together and talk about it. So if a parent picks up my book, do the tools yourself, understand, recognize, and discover what's going on inside of you, and then try and facilitate with your teens and have these spaces of vulnerability to connect. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Can you share with the listeners the best way for them to connect with you?
Sure. Well, my book can be found on Amazon all over. And in fact, my son right now is recording the audio version. I don't know why I never did that. I'm not super
Yeah.
crazy about my speaking voice, but he's got a beautiful voice. So that should be coming up in a few months. You could find me anywhere online. I'm all over social. But if you are interested in the work that I do with teens and coaching with families as well, or parents, you can find me at transformativementoringforteens.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll drop those links into the show notes as well.
Thank you.
It has been such a pleasure having you on today. I've learned so much, and you're got so much wisdom and knowledge and experience and expertise. Thank you for sharing with our listeners today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Empowered Living. I hope today's conversation sparked some inspiration and gave you tools to live more intentionally in your family, work, and life. If you enjoyed our episode today, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an inspiring story or actionable takeaway. And if you know someone who would love this episode, share it with them, because living an intentional life is better when we do it together. Until next time, remember, the life you want doesn't happen by chance. It happens by choice. Let's keep creating it one step at a time.